Okay. Chris represents InRule, a well-known business rule vendor and highly used by different customers over the years. But this is the first time when InRule joins us at DecisionCAMP, and I'm happy to welcome Chris. And hopefully you will be more active now with after this event. And I never personally met Chris yet, but last year I listened his presentation at BBC, and I believe Chris has quite a unique opportunity to explain complex issues in a very simple terms. So let's listen. Chris, take over.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up. Okay. Well, what I'd like to talk about today are the enduring problems that we can see that every project has when it starts. And so when I was thinking about a presentation for DecisionCAMP that's focused on practitioners, I thought this would be a great time to talk about why some projects fail and why others do not. And while we have a lot of technology at our disposal, the breadth of tech that we have within a decision model just seems to keep expanding, from machine learning to traditional decisions to optimization. With all this technology, certainly we can solve some problems, but why is it that still some projects are failing and struggling to catch on within an organization? So I thought let's take a look at it kind of top down and try and understand this. So let's start with an insurance company that I was working with a couple of years ago. They're in the Midwest. They had the product, they had our product in this case, for 2 years, and still no active projects. So there was an architect who was still operating within this perpetual POC, and by the time we got there to talk, we realized he was doing some of the same activities and just never got beyond the initial integration work that he was doing. So they were doing a novel integration with the mainframe. They actually got that working really well, but that wasn't the problem that the business had. And the team was struggling to understand that. And I started asking myself, well, was this a budget issue? What was going on? And we learned that the IT spend for that same company, it continued unabated with no changes. The percentage of spend into IT to keep the lights on was static. And the percentage allocated for strategic work was still there. They just couldn't get the traction. And interestingly enough, in the 2 years that this was going on, at no time did anyone in the company state any disbelief about the technology or the potential to solve their business problems. They just simply hadn't found the problem to engage with, and they were spinning their wheels. And what's interesting about this is we start to as we start to look at it, there's a lot of risks going on early in the project. And often we find that folks are just very focused on integration as the #1 risk. Maybe because it seems more familiar, maybe because it seems like it's a lot of work. But what we find is that it's the risks that are familiar that are the ones likely to impact the team in the most serious ways. And so it's still hard to get the folks excited about orienting towards some of these other well-known risks. But it's really important to the team for them to understand that the majority of risks outside of or including integration are all going to occur within the first 3 weeks of the project. And you ask yourself, well, what is the cost of failure? What is the cost of, when you're working with a commercial product, the cost of the licensing, but weigh that against the cost of 10 people that don't really know what they're going to do. What's the cost of a team taking 4 months to do something that they could have done in less time if they had just had all the agreement in place and they had mitigated all those risks. So we feel that, this is just really important for practitioners to think about. And I've been, for the past 2 years, I've been researching this and trying to come up with ideas to share with teams and other practitioners to try and walk through and accelerate projects as they go through these early phases. And I know I'm not the only one that's doing this. There's lots of folks that have been successful in bringing these practices together. But to put a spotlight on it, I think is still important while there's still projects out there that are struggling. In the case of this customer, the trouble was pretty well known. The project just wasn't aligned with the strategic goals of the project. There wasn't a clear structure to the team. They didn't have, because they didn't have enough people, they didn't have all the skills that were represented. And while they were focusing on integration, they just didn't understand all the technologies that might need to come into play if they had landed on a project with the core aspects of the business. And then finally, there's just the fear and uncertainty. Sometimes just the psychology of that new project. Sometimes projects have failed 3 times. And then the team members are wondering, is this really going to work? Maybe they had never applied decision management technology before to solve the problem, but that fear and uncertainty always hangs around there. And I got to thinking, we've got these operational models. We know how to do this. It's pretty well known how to get operational decisions deployed and make them run. And decision models as another layer helps us understand how to get to how to move from requirements into an actual model that will execute, how to do the discovery around the requirements. But I believe that there's another model that's less talked about that sits on top of the decision model. And maybe the decision model is pointing to some of this with the knowledge sources and whatnot, but it's really the practice. It's the human interaction that we're going to have. It's the activities we're going to do as a team, especially in the early stages of the project, where all or most of the risk is going to happen in the early days of the project, and how we talk to each other, the core beliefs that we have. Maybe there is another model that we need that is more of the practice model that sits on top of everything else that we're doing to ensure that the team is asking all the right questions and moving things forward. And if we were to do that, if we were to come up with a practice model, I started asking myself, well, what would this look like? What kind of core values would we have? Obviously, transparency is top of the list because we want everything as transparent as possible. What kind of accountability do we have? Are we working, do we have the right stakeholders? Are we playing back to them? Trust, maybe autonomy. The teams could figure out their own core values. I figure if Agile can have core values, why can't decision management have a set of core values that really express what we're trying to do? And also what I like at the end of the day is courage, the encouragement to share, to be transparent, and to, be willing to ask the hard questions and move a team forward. But certainly, as we think about defining the practices, I have 11 here, but these are all things that need to be talked about at the very beginning of a project. What kind of leadership do we have? The stakeholders, the team members and roles, team building activities. So while we've been, it's fun to talk about how we're going to put the put it all together technically. It's fun to talk about how the APIs are going to work. Those are all interesting, but in the early days, what we're going to do together is a really critical problem, and what is the business going to get out of the effort is very critical, and that's what's going to help help the team baseline about what it is we're going to do together. So what I have done just to get the conversation going is I've created a questionnaire. It's modeled roughly after the Rockefeller habits. And I won't go into too much detail about what that is or where it came from. You can Google it. But essentially, it's a way to express, it's a checklist that has been successful for helping organizations scale. And what I've done is I've simply applied that to the practices around decision management to just help the team orient. I've also taken that one step further where I've been scoring these, and it can help a team visually to understand where their risks are, where they're weak, what they haven't talked about. And if they run this a couple of times throughout the project, they can see themselves mature over time. Now, is this a maturity model? Is this something that is intended to be rigorous or rigid? That wasn't the intention. It was really a way to get a conversation going. And as we go through this with folks, there's any number of practices or activities that the team can do together that answers the question. There's probably several ways to answer all those questions. So whether it comes from design thinking or it's going to come from some other practice that folks have had success with, that's great. But what I'm trying to express here is, maybe there is a practice model that can be shared, that can be contributed to, and can help practitioners worldwide. And it would look something like this, the stakeholders. Do we know who they are? Do we have our cadence of meetings in place? Are they going to help us secure a budget? Oftentimes by the time you're thinking about this and someone's got to secure a budget, someone has to put a team together, and we need some executive sponsorship to get this going. So hopefully some of that is a quick yes, but sometimes it's not. And then that falls into team building activities, like someone's got to manage all the people that are going to do work on this project. Sometimes you get into cases where what does a rule author look like? Who are they? What can they do? Sometimes folks count them on the team as a full-time, but they already have a job. They're already working somewhere else, and someone isn't really looking at how their time is occupied, or they haven't had those meetings to help change the organization to get those people in place. And maybe there isn't a training plan in place, but these are all the kind of prerequisite activities before we even get to decision modeling and those interesting things. There's these upfront team building exercises. And there's quite a few of these, so I'm only going to walk us through 3, but I'm going to end on agreeing on the problem, because I think this is just so critical for baselining the team. Can everybody understand or state why this project is taking place? And can everybody state the problem that we're going to solve and why it's so difficult to operate without solving this problem? Sometimes you get into these exercises and we realize that's not the best problem to go after, and we have to pivot. But having the exercise to really go through alignment exercise to the strategic problems that are taking place. For example, with our insurance company in the Midwest, what we learned was that there was a digital transformation project taking place with the call center. And there were all kinds of decision opportunities taking place there. But while the team was focused on integration, they weren't able to engage with the executive that was part of the call center operations problem, which would have had a dramatic impact on the costs of the organization, would have improved margin, and that would in turn have improved cash flow. So all those things were really connecting, but they weren't connecting with the team that was doing that initial POC. And, you know, along the way, you know, there's the active risks. So, you know, are we looking at all the risks that are known and unknown? So I believe that there is a way forward. There is a way forward with a practice model that gets us somewhere. And if we had this, and this is an example of a team that went through this exercise, I believe we could start predicting where teams would fall and what their level of maturity is. In this case, this team of several people, when they started, there's just this general set of scores. One person seemed to know a lot about what was going on, but right next to them is someone who knew very little about what was going on. So they knew 16% of the questions that are in this questionnaire versus someone else. So it's great that somebody knows a little bit of everything, but if the team doesn't know it, they're going to be spinning. And as you go through the activities, doing those team activities, it's just going to be so important. And I feel like it's these early activities, you know, before you get into the decision model. I think that, you know, in those first 3 weeks, those are really critical. So I am open to having discussions with folks that are interested in this questionnaire or practice model, or want to talk about how this could be done better by the community. I'm very open to that. And so I'll open it up for questions.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. We have a question from James Taylor. He says, what's the difference between agreeing on the problem and agreeing on the decision model of the problem, at least at a high level? And he said, we use the decision model to address this issue right at the start. Obviously, there are other things too, like risks and assumptions, but the decision model should be core.
Absolutely. So where I think the decision model is strong is when we start talking about specific policy statements and real requirements that are going into you know, the inputs of a decision. But before we get to that layer, before we can talk about requirements, it's really or rules, specific rules and decisions. I think it's important to talk about you know, what is the business process that we're looking at? How does the problem surface? Why are we looking at it? What is the cost of that problem? And so there's a whole set of activities that I think will feed into the decision model, but I think there is a very large swath of activities that are not represented in the decision model that are very social, very whiteboard oriented, that helps the team get that early alignment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I don't see any other specific questions in the channel, but Jacob, I know you always have some interesting questions and discussion points, even when you are muted.
Probably it's a little bit, I should rest a little bit. I'm tired. Thank you.
All right, any other questions? Well, I'll still be around, and I'm willing to answer questions later in the Slack channel. So I look forward to those from everyone.
James did have a follow-up where he said he would do it the other way around. He'd build a decision model and annotate it with these additional things, not create these things as inputs to the decision model. So it sounds like you two are doing things in sort of opposite ways.
Yeah, I think in the end, I've been wanting to talk with James about this actually, but I believe you end up in the same spot. I tend to like going from the macro into the micro, just like how it's important to, before we get too technical, you get the larger picture things out of the way. So my concern is that we don't drop into the decision model too quickly, and that we have practices that are better represented by I don't think Agile solves this problem very well in the set of ceremonies because it lacks a business language. I don't think design thinking completely solves it because it's tends to be oriented around the journey, but that you can still decorate that with lots of business information, which is helpful. And then there's strategic business practice that none of those address, like certain kinds of activities that you would do to understand a business or a set of business risks. So all of these are things that the team either needs to represent or some small group has to represent these as you come in and you really package up the project. So if you think of like a package that the business will understand, the decision model doesn't necessarily render itself to that executive level package. So
okay. Now, Rolando thinks you've left us with a cliffhanger. He wants to know what the rest of the story is and how did the insurance company end up? Like, don't leave us hanging here.
What happened? So they did finally get traction, and they're working with us closely. It took 2 years, and one of the internal teams finally did bite, and they've got support, and they are moving. They're moving along, and it's not just an individual. So that's another lesson. You got to scale the success. You got to scale the team, and it takes more than one person for sure.
Right. 2 years sounds about right for getting an insurance company engaged to work with them on the process side.
Yes, lots of moving parts, and but it is so worthwhile. And I think they, as they're exploring, they had their own discoveries. Their IT processes improving and things like that. But I won't go into details. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, it's actually I'm just interested with the insurance industry in general is what the sort of uptake is for bringing in new technologies. Like traditionally, I find them to be extremely conservative, and the idea of bringing in automated decisioning or AI or even automated processes, it seems to be a bit of an uphill push.
It is, and that when you're doing these top level exercises, sometimes the technology footprint falls outside of the traditional decision management space. So if that's the case, then that's the added risk. And for this company, where they stepped out of the typical boundary was their novel integration with a mainframe. But had they hooked in earlier, they might have been connecting to a CRM system, or there were other things outside of the traditional DMS footprint that they were having to handle. So you have to be with them as they go through the discovery process and the there's a psychology that's happening, where people are kind of moving through their own anxiety about what something is, and then pivoting and being present with them when they go through that process. So there's a lot of multiple facets to the team going through this experience together.
Right. And usually you're dealing with, like, if you're talking about underwriting and policy administration, obviously these are, very often bespoke old legacy systems.
Correct.
On the claims side, it's often an off-the-shelf claim system like Guidewire or something like that, but it's that can also be a legacy thing, but a lot of them have moved to more off the shelf. But in both cases, the decisions will be built into those systems, or they will be based on the human knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. And to James' benefit, the model is a great way to start breaking those problems down so that you're not boiling the ocean. But at some point, that high-level discussion still has to take place. So I think there's a compatible space for the practice model to marry up with the decision model for sure. I see them as complementary. So James can take me to task later.
Yes, looks like we have lots of room for open discussion there still.
That's right.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Chris. We're going to get ready for the next presentation.
Thanks, everyone.